Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the biggest misconceptions about the Middle Ages, the idea that every medieval peasant owned absolutely nothing beyond the clothes on their back and perhaps an optimistic chicken. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you asked someone to picture a medieval peasant, chances are they'd imagine a miserable fellow trudging through ankle-deep mud, wearing what appears to be an old potato sack with sleeves, clutching half a loaf of stale bread while staring enviously at the castle on the hill. His house is collapsing, his stomach is permanently empty, and his greatest luxury is not being rained on for at least 20 minutes. According to popular culture, peasants spent the Middle Ages one minor inconvenience away from complete catastrophe. It is an image we've seen countless times in films, television series, and video games. The only problem is that history politely disagrees. Certainly, medieval peasants lived difficult lives. They worked from sunrise until sunset, paid taxes, rents, and various fees to their lord, worried constantly about the weather, and had no idea what a weekend was. The phrase work-life balance would have sounded like advanced sorcery. Even so, being poor did not mean owning absolutely nothing. In fact, many peasant families accumulated a surprising number of valuable possessions over the course of their lives. To understand why this misconception exists, we first have to remember that people today measure wealth very differently than people did 700 or 800 years ago. Today, much of our wealth is invisible. Bank accounts, retirement funds, investments, digital businesses, and enough streaming subscriptions to accidentally finance a small kingdom every month. You can technically own thousands of dollars without possessing anything more impressive than a smartphone. A medieval villager, on the other hand, measured prosperity almost entirely through tangible things. Did you own a house? How much land could your family cultivate? How many sheep wandered around pretending not to hear you? Did you have enough grain stored to survive a harsh winter? Could your ox pull a plough without immediately questioning its life choices? Those were the questions that determined whether a family was comfortable or struggling. Every object inside a medieval home represented an extraordinary amount of labour. A wooden table wasn't something you picked up on sale after wandering through a furniture warehouse for 45 minutes, searching for aisle 17. First, someone had to select a suitable tree, cut it down by hand, transport the timber, season the wood for months, shape every plank using axes and adzes, and finally assemble it with carefully crafted wooden joints. By the time the table was finished, everyone involved had probably become personally acquainted with back pain. The same was true for an iron axe. Before it could chop a single piece of firewood, miners had to extract the ore, charcoal burners prepared enormous quantities of fuel, blacksmiths spent hours working blistering hot furnaces, and skilled craftsmen forged, hardened, and sharpened the blade. It wasn't just a tool. It was the product of countless hours of specialized work. Even clothing required astonishing effort. A simple wool cloak began its life on a sheep. The fleece had to be sheared, cleaned, combed, spun into thread, woven into cloth, dyed if the family could afford it, and finally sewn by hand. Months of labour could disappear into a single garment. Unsurprisingly, people repaired clothing again and again, rather than throwing it away. If your tunic developed a hole, you patched it. If it developed another hole, you patched that one too. Eventually the patches themselves required patches, and congratulations, you now owned a perfectly respectable medieval fashion statement. This is one reason medieval theft laws seem surprisingly harsh. Stealing a cow wasn't merely taking someone's livestock. You were stealing years of milk, butter, cheese, future calves, leather, manure for fertilizing crops, and a significant portion of the family's financial security. It was closer to emptying someone's savings account than borrowing their lawnmower without asking. The historical evidence reflects this reality remarkably well. Thousands of surviving wills, tax records, estate inventories, court documents, and archaeological excavations reveal homes containing beds, benches, tables, stools, wooden chests, iron cooking pots, knives, spoons, spinning wheels, farming tools, barrels, candles, livestock, and enough household equipment to keep an entire family functioning year after year. Archaeologists have uncovered locks, keys, jewellery, pottery, gaming pieces, musical instruments, combs, and decorative objects in villages that Hollywood would have us believe contained nothing but mud and disappointment. Of course, not every peasant enjoyed the same standard of living. Some families struggled desperately, especially after famine, disease, or war. Others gradually built comfortable households through decades of careful work, good harvests, and perhaps a cow that consistently remembered its job description. Medieval society was far more diverse than the simple picture of rich nobles and poor peasants suggests. So tonight, we're leaving behind the familiar stereotype. Instead of imagining empty cottages occupied by perpetually miserable people, we'll step inside real medieval homes where every possession had a story, every tool had earned its place, and every wooden chest represented years of careful saving. By the end of our journey, you may never look at a medieval peasant the same way again. You may also find yourself feeling strangely impressed by someone who considered owning 2 pigs, an iron cauldron, and a sturdy goose to be a remarkably well-diversified investment portfolio. Frankly, the goose was probably the most unpredictable asset. For many people today, the phrase medieval peasant's house immediately brings to mind a tiny shack that looked as though a particularly strong gust of wind could convert it into firewood. Surprisingly, many of these homes were sturdier and more valuable than we give them credit for. Now, to avoid disappointing the lawyers in the audience, we should clarify something. Owning a medieval house wasn't always the same as owning the land beneath it. In much of medieval Europe, the local lord technically owned the manor, while peasant families held the right to occupy and work particular plots. Think of it as an arrangement with considerably more chickens and considerably fewer pages of legal fine print. Still, the house itself often belonged to the family. Parents built it, children repaired it, grandchildren inherited it. Some cottages remained in the same family for generations, slowly expanding as each generation added another room, rebuilt a wall, or replaced aging timbers. Medieval home improvement was less about choosing between modern and rustic decor, and more about hoping the roof survived another winter. Building a house required an enormous investment of labour. Timber had to be cut, hauled, and shaped by hand. Stone foundations, where available, demanded days of backbreaking work. Walls might be constructed from woven branches covered with clay, straw, and manure, a surprisingly effective mixture once it dried. The roof required hundreds of bundles of carefully prepared thatch, tied together with remarkable skill. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. A well-maintained thatched roof could last 20 or 30 years before needing major repairs. And despite modern jokes, medieval cottages did not spontaneously burst into flames every Tuesday. Inside, the home was far from empty. The central hearth provided warmth, light, and a place to cook. Smoke drifted upward through the roof, which admittedly wasn't ideal for anyone hoping to preserve a spotless ceiling. On the bright side, the constant smoke helped discourage insects and preserved the wooden beams. Your eyes watered, but the termites were equally unhappy. Furniture was simple but functional. A sturdy table, several benches, wooden stools, storage chests, shelves, and one or more beds filled the space. Wealthier peasant families might even have separate sleeping areas, while poorer households often shared a single room with children, grandparents, and occasionally a few animals during especially harsh winters. Sharing your bedroom with a cow may sound unpleasant today. To a medieval family, however, it made perfect sense. The animal stayed warm, was less likely to be stolen, and produced body heat that helped warm the house. Modern central heating is certainly more convenient, but it rarely provides fresh milk in the morning. By the end of the Middle Ages, many prosperous villagers owned homes that reflected decades of careful work and steady improvement. They weren't castles, nor were they luxurious by modern standards, but they were valuable family assets. These cottages represented security, stability, and generations of accumulated effort, proof that a medieval peasant's greatest possession often wasn't hidden inside the house at all. It was the house itself. If a medieval peasant had been asked what their most valuable possession was, they almost certainly wouldn't have pointed to their house, their livestock, or even that expensive iron cooking pot they guarded as if it contained the Holy Grail. They would have pointed to the ground beneath their feet. Land was everything. Not because it was beautiful, although a healthy wheat field certainly had its charms, but because nearly every aspect of survival depended on it. No land meant no crops. No crops meant no bread. No bread meant a very unpleasant conversation with your stomach that could last all winter. Of course, owning land during the Middle Ages was rarely straightforward. Across much of Europe, the local lord legally owned the manor. Peasant families instead held customary rights to farm particular strips of land, sometimes paying rent in labour, produce, or money. It sounds terribly restrictive to modern ears, but many of these rights were remarkably stable. A family's fields often passed from parents to children for generations, creating a strong sense that the land was, for all practical purposes, theirs. Imagine looking across a field your grandfather had ploughed, your father had planted, and now your own children were learning to cultivate. That connection ran deep. Unlike modern farms, medieval villages usually divided farmland into long, narrow strips scattered across enormous open fields. One family might farm 20 or 30 separate strips spread throughout the village. At first glance, this arrangement seems wonderfully inconvenient, almost as if someone had organised agriculture by throwing darts at a map. There was actually a reason for it. Different parts of the countryside had different soil quality. Some strips were fertile, others rocky. Some drained well, others turned into muddy swamps after heavy rain. By spreading everyone's land around, no single family received all the good ground, or all the terrible ground. Medieval fairness wasn't perfect, but it was often surprisingly practical. Most families also maintained a small garden beside their cottage. These gardens produced onions, cabbages, peas, beans, leeks, herbs, apples, and countless other foods that rarely appear in dramatic television adaptations, perhaps because The Great Cabbage Harvest of 1248 doesn't sound like an award-winning screenplay. Yet these humble gardens were vital. Fresh vegetables improved diets, medicinal herbs treated common illnesses, and fruit trees provided food that could be dried or stored for winter. Some households even grew flowers, not because they were wealthy, but because people have always appreciated a little beauty after spending the day digging in the dirt. Many villages also shared access to meadows, forests, and common land. After harvest, families could graze animals on open fields. Meadows provided hay for winter. forests supplied timber, mushrooms, berries, nuts, and firewood. Losing these rights could devastate a household almost as much as losing the fields themselves. Land, therefore, wasn't measured only by acreage. It included everything that land made possible. A productive field became bread, a meadow became milk, an orchard became cider, a woodland became warmth through the cold months. To a medieval peasant, wealth wasn't simply something you counted, it was something that grew, season after season, beneath your boots. And if the weather cooperated, which it often stubbornly refused to do, that patchwork of fields could provide not just survival, but the foundation for a surprisingly comfortable life. If land was the foundation of a medieval family's wealth, then livestock was the insurance policy that walked around on four legs. Today, if someone wants to build financial security, they might open a savings account, invest in the stock market, or reluctantly check an app that informs them their retirement fund is experiencing temporary volatility. A medieval peasant had a much simpler system. They bought another sheep, or a pig, or if fortune had smiled particularly brightly that year, a cow. Animals were far more than food. They were living investments that could produce value every single day. A healthy cow provided milk, which could be turned into butter and cheese. Those products lasted much longer than fresh milk and could be sold at nearby markets. A single dairy cow could support an entire household, making it one of the most valuable possessions an ordinary family could own. Oxen were even more impressive. Unlike horses, which were expensive to purchase and maintain, oxen were the dependable workhorses of medieval agriculture. They pulled heavy ploughs through dense soil, hauled carts full of grain, transported timber, and generally spent their lives performing jobs that would leave most modern gym enthusiasts requesting several weeks off. Without an ox, ploughing large fields became painfully slow. With one, a family could cultivate far more land, harvest more grain, and ultimately build greater prosperity. Sheep offered a different kind of wealth. Every year they produced fresh wool, one of medieval Europe's most valuable resources. Wool could be spun into thread, woven into cloth, and turned into clothing or blankets. In many regions, wool became such an important trade commodity that entire towns grew wealthy from producing it. A flock of sheep wasn't simply grazing, it was quietly manufacturing next year's wardrobe. Pigs, meanwhile, earned their reputation as remarkably efficient investments. Unlike cows or sheep, pigs could eat almost anything. Kitchen scraps, fallen acorns, forest roots, leftover vegetables, and countless other foods unsuitable for humans could all become pork. They required relatively little pasture and reproduced quickly, making them ideal for growing families. The medieval pig was essentially nature's recycling program, although admittedly with considerably louder opinions. Even chickens played an important role. A few hens provided eggs throughout much of the year, while extra birds could be sold or exchanged with neighbours. Geese guarded farmyards with surprising enthusiasm, often proving more suspicious of strangers than many village dogs. Anyone considering sneaking into a medieval farm usually discovered that geese possessed both excellent hearing and absolutely no interest in diplomacy. Some families also kept goats, particularly in rocky regions where cattle struggled to graze. Goats supplied milk, cheese, and occasionally demonstrated an extraordinary ability to escape almost any enclosure ever constructed. It seems some traditions have survived the centuries completely unchanged. Perhaps the most overlooked livestock of all were bees. Many monasteries and peasant households maintained beehives because honey was the primary sweetener available to most people. Sugar remained a rare luxury imported from distant lands, but honey could sweeten food, preserve fruit, and even produce mead. bees also provided wax for candles, an everyday necessity long before anyone could simply flip a light switch. Because animals represented so much wealth, protecting them became a matter of survival. Livestock theft was treated as a serious crime. Diseases spreading through a herd could ruin years of careful saving. Harsh winters forced families to calculate exactly how much hay they needed to keep their animals alive until spring. To modernize, a medieval farmyard might appear ordinary. To the family living there, every moo, cluck, bleat, grunt, and occasionally rather aggressive honk represented something much greater. It represented security, income, food, and the hope that next year might be just a little better than the last. In a world without banks, pensions, or insurance companies, the livestock in your yard was quite literally your savings account, and unlike today's financial advisors, it occasionally laid eggs. Walk into a medieval peasant's kitchen, and at first glance you might think there isn't much to see. A fire burns in the hearth. A blackened iron pot hangs above the flames. A few wooden bowls sit on a shelf. Bread cools on the table, while bundles of herbs hang from the rafters. Simple, but don't let simplicity fool you. Almost everything in that room represented months, sometimes years, of careful saving. Let's start with the most important object in the house, the cooking pot. Today, if your saucepan wears out, you can drive to a store or order another one online without giving it much thought. A medieval peasant couldn't do that. An iron cauldron required miners to dig iron ore, charcoal burners to prepare fuel, blacksmiths to smelt and forge the metal, and merchants to transport the finished product to market. By the time that pot reached your kitchen, dozens of people had contributed to its creation. It was expensive. Really expensive. Many families owned only one large iron pot, and it served nearly every meal for decades. Porridge, vegetable stew, soups, beans, meat when fortune smiled, and enough cabbage to convince future generations that medieval cuisine had entered into an exclusive relationship with the vegetable. If the pot cracked, it wasn't simply annoying. It was a household emergency. Wooden bowls and spoons were far cheaper, but they still required skilled craftsmanship. A village carpenter carefully carved each piece by hand, often from maple, beech, or ash. Families treasured them, repaired them when possible, and replaced them only when absolutely necessary. Knives were another prized possession. Most people owned only one general-purpose knife, carried almost everywhere. It prepared food, cut rope, carved wood, repaired tools, and occasionally reminded overly curious geese to maintain a respectful distance. Forks, meanwhile, were still uncommon across much of medieval Europe. People usually ate with knives, spoons, and their fingers, which historians politely describe as traditional dining practices. Food storage mattered just as much as cooking. Large wooden barrels stored grain, ale, salted meat, and preserved vegetables. Clay jars held butter, cheese, honey, and dried herbs. Linen sacks protected flour from moisture, while hanging racks kept onions, garlic, and herbs dry throughout the year. Without refrigeration, preserving food required constant planning. Salt became one of the household's greatest allies. Meat could be salted, fish dried, vegetables pickled, and fruit preserved with honey. A successful autumn wasn't measured by how impressive the harvest looked in the field, but by how full the pantry remained when February arrived, and everyone had forgotten what fresh strawberries tasted like. Bread occupied the centre of nearly every meal. Some families baked in their own ovens, while many villages shared communal ovens maintained by the lord or local baker. Using these ovens often required paying a small fee, which occasionally frustrated villagers who had grown the grain, harvested the grain, milled the grain, kneaded the dough, and now found themselves paying someone else to make it hot. Even the fire itself demanded effort. Firewood had to be gathered, chopped, dried, stacked, and carefully rationed throughout the year. A roaring fire on a cold winter evening wasn't just cosy, it represented months of preparation. The medieval kitchen, then, was far more than a place to cook dinner. It was the economic heart of the household, filled with possessions that transformed raw harvests into survival. Every spoon, every barrel, every knife, and especially that faithful iron pot, earned its place through years of labour. Looking around that humble room, a medieval peasant didn't see ordinary household objects. They saw security, and perhaps one more pot of cabbage stew. Again. When most people imagine medieval furniture, they picture a room containing one lonely stool, a questionable-looking table, and perhaps a pile of straw generously described as a bed. Reality, as it often enjoys doing, was a little more complicated. Even ordinary peasant households accumulated furniture throughout their lives, piece by piece. They rarely bought an entire matching set, mostly because medieval furniture stores had yet to invent the revolutionary concept of making customers wander through a giant maze before reaching the exit. Instead, every item had its own story. A father might build a table for his new family. A grandfather could carve a sturdy bench that survived 3 generations. A marriage might bring a beautifully crafted wooden chest into the household as part of a bride's dowry. Furniture wasn't fashionable, it was an investment. The single most valuable piece inside many homes was often the bed. Now, before your imagination starts picturing a luxurious mattress with memory foam and adjustable lumbar support, lower your expectations by approximately 800 years. Most beds consisted of a sturdy wooden frame supporting ropes or wooden slats, topped with a mattress stuffed with straw, wool, feathers, or dried grasses. Wealthier peasant families sometimes owned feather mattresses, which were considerably softer and represented genuine prosperity. A feather bed was something to be proud of. It also had the remarkable ability to collect every feather that escaped over the years, slowly decorating the bedroom like an extremely slow snowstorm. Beds were expensive. So expensive, in fact, that they frequently appeared as individual entries in wills. Parents carefully decided which child would inherit the family's best bed, because everyone understood its value. A good bed could last decades with proper maintenance, and replacing one required an enormous amount of timber, craftsmanship, and labour. Tables occupied the centre of family life. Meals were eaten there. Tools were repaired there. Children learned household skills there. Neighbours gathered around it during celebrations, while disputes were sometimes settled across its worn wooden surface. It wasn't merely furniture. It was the social centre of the home. Benches and stools surrounded the table. Unlike modern dining chairs, benches served several purposes at once. They provided seating during meals, places to work during the day, and occasionally makeshift beds for unexpected guests. Medieval furniture believed firmly in multitasking. There simply wasn't enough room or money for anything else. Then there were the chests. If one object symbolized a family's accumulated wealth, it was the wooden chest. Almost every household owned at least one. These sturdy boxes stored clothing, blankets, legal documents, coins, family heirlooms, candles, tools, and anything else worth protecting. Many included locks, and owning a lock with an actual key carried a certain prestige. It announced to the village that you possessed something valuable enough to discourage curious neighbours with unusually flexible moral standards. Shelves lined the walls, holding pottery, wooden bowls, drinking cups, and cooking utensils. Pegs supported cloaks, hats, baskets, and tools. Every bit of available space was used efficiently, because cottages were not exactly famous for their spacious open-floor plans. Open your wardrobe for a moment. Now imagine that every shirt hanging inside required months of work to produce. Suddenly that old sweater you've been meaning to donate doesn't seem quite so ordinary. For a medieval peasant, clothing was one of the most valuable possessions a family could own. It wasn't something you bought because this season's colours had changed, or because an advertisement convinced you that you absolutely needed another jacket, despite already owning 6 remarkably similar ones. Every garment represented an extraordinary investment of time. It all began with the sheep. Each spring, the flock was carefully sheared, producing thick fleece that looked rather unimpressive at first glance. That wool then had to be washed repeatedly to remove dirt, grease, and whatever embarrassing adventures the sheep had experienced over the previous year. Next came carding, where the fibres were combed until they lay neatly together. Only then could spinning begin. Using a spindle or spinning wheel, someone, usually the women of the household, slowly twisted loose fibres into thread. It was patient, repetitive work that could occupy countless evenings beside the hearth. One conversation after another, one story after another, and still the thread continued to grow. Once enough yarn had been produced, it was woven into cloth on a loom. Weaving itself demanded remarkable skill. A single mistake could weaken an entire piece of fabric, meaning hours of careful work might need to be redone. Modern machines can weave miles of cloth in a day. A medieval weaver considered it a productive afternoon if nobody accidentally tangled half the loom. After weaving came cutting and sewing. Unlike modern clothing factories, there was no room for waste. Every scrap of cloth was carefully measured because fabric itself was precious. Small leftover pieces were saved for patches, children's clothing, or future repairs. Nothing useful was thrown away, which is fortunate because repairs were constant. A torn sleeve wasn't replaced. It was mended. A worn elbow received a patch, then another patch. Eventually the patches themselves became worn and required patches of their own. Medieval fashion often followed the simple principle that if enough stitches held something together, then technically it was still one garment. Most peasant families owned surprisingly few outfits. An ordinary person might have one set of working clothes for everyday labour, and a better set reserved for Sundays, religious festivals, weddings, or other important occasions. That good tunic might be worn only a handful of times each year and carefully stored afterward to preserve it as long as possible. Cloaks were especially prized. A thick wool cloak protected against rain, wind, and winter cold. Considering medieval weather forecasts generally consisted of looking at the sky and hoping for the best, a dependable cloak could feel almost miraculous. Belts completed many outfits, serving a purpose far beyond simply keeping trousers, where everyone politely expected them to remain. Knives, purses, pouches, tools, keys, and countless everyday items hung from belts. Leaving the house without one was rather like forgetting your wallet, your backpack, and your phone all at once, though admittedly with fewer notifications demanding your attention. Shoes were another significant expense. Most were made from leather and repaired repeatedly by local cobblers. Soles wore thin, stitching loosened, and holes appeared after years of walking muddy roads and rocky fields. New shoes weren't purchased because they looked stylish. They were purchased because the old pair had finally surrendered after a heroic career. Clothing also carried emotional value. Parents passed garments down to children. Wedding clothes became family treasures. Fine cloaks appeared in wills alongside livestock and furniture. A well-made garment wasn't merely fabric stitched together. It represented hundreds of hours of labour, generations of practical knowledge, and a family's determination to care for what they owned. In medieval Europe, Your wardrobe wasn't about impressing strangers. It was about staying warm, surviving another winter, and proving that careful craftsmanship could outlast fashion by several centuries. If you could travel back to a medieval village and ask a peasant to show you their most valuable possessions, don't be surprised if they walked straight past the family chest, ignored the feather mattress, and proudly picked up an old, slightly rusty axe. It may not look impressive, but that axe could be the reason the family had a house, firewood, fences, furniture, and enough timber to survive the winter. In the Middle Ages, tools were wealth, not metaphorically, quite literally. A good tool could increase a family's harvest, save countless hours of labour, and last for decades if properly maintained. Losing one wasn't merely inconvenient, it could threaten an entire year's work. Take the plough, for example. It was arguably the single most important agricultural tool in medieval Europe. Heavy iron ploughs allowed farmers to turn the dense clay soils of northern Europe far more effectively than older wooden designs. Better ploughing meant healthier crops, larger harvests, and fewer hungry winters. Of course, owning a plough wasn't cheap. A village blacksmith spent days forging its iron parts, while skilled carpenters shaped the heavy wooden frame. Most families treated their plough with more care than many people today treat their cars. Admittedly, the plough was also less likely to develop mysterious warning lights for no apparent reason. Then there was the humble axe. It chopped firewood, built houses, repaired fences, shaped furniture, cleared fields, cut wagon parts, and occasionally reminded stubborn tree stumps that humans were remarkably persistent creatures. Few tools worked harder. The same could be said for the sickle. At harvest time, entire families carried these curved blades into the fields to cut wheat, barley, oats, and rye. Harvest season was a race against time. Every day mattered. A week of heavy rain could flatten ripe grain, while an early frost might destroy months of careful work. The sickle became an extension of the farmer's arm, and when the harvest finally ended, it was carefully sharpened, cleaned, and stored until the following year. Hammers, chisels, saws, augers, adzes, and planes filled the workshops of village craftsmen. Even households that weren't professional carpenters often owned a handful of woodworking tools for everyday repairs, because repairs never stopped. A broken gate, a cracked wheel, a leaking roof, a loose table leg. Life in the countryside had an astonishing ability to create new jobs before yesterday's ones had even been finished. Textile tools were equally important. Nearly every household possessed spinning equipment. At first, most spinning was done using a simple drop spindle, a wonderfully clever device consisting of little more than a weighted stick. It was inexpensive, portable, and remarkably effective. Later, spinning wheels began appearing across Europe, allowing thread to be produced much faster. For many women, spinning wasn't a hobby. It was part of daily life. During quiet evenings around the hearth, hands continued working almost automatically while conversations flowed, children played nearby, and someone inevitably complained about the weather. Some traditions truly are timeless. Looms represented another significant investment. Larger looms often remained permanently assembled inside the home, because dismantling and rebuilding them would have been almost as frustrating as assembling modern flat-pack furniture, except without the comforting knowledge that at least there was an instruction manual somewhere. Then there were carts. A sturdy two-wheeled cart transformed what a family could accomplish. Firewood, grain, hay, stones, barrels, livestock, and building materials all became easier to transport. A cart wasn't simply convenient. It expanded a family's entire economic world. Perhaps most importantly, tools were almost never discarded. A damaged axe head was reforged. A broken hammer handle was replaced. A dull knife was sharpened again and again until hardly any original metal remained. If you had visited a medieval doctor because you and your spouse had been unable to have children, you probably would not have left with a reassuring explanation. You certainly would not have received a blood test, a hormone analysis, or a scan. Instead, you would have stepped into a world where medicine balanced awkwardly between careful observation, ancient philosophy, religious belief, and an impressive amount of confident guessing. Medieval physicians genuinely wanted to help. The unfortunate detail was that they were working with scientific knowledge that had taken a very long vacation. Infertility was one of the greatest mysteries of medieval life because children meant everything. They carried on the family name, inherited land, worked farms, supported parents in old age, and, for kings and nobles, prevented kingdoms from collapsing into spectacular succession crises. If a couple remained childless, it was rarely viewed as simple bad luck. There had to be a reason. The question was which one. Most medieval doctors based their understanding on the writings of ancient Greek authorities, particularly Hippocrates and Galen. Their books had survived for centuries and were treated almost with the respect of sacred texts. If Galen had written something in the 2nd century, questioning it in the 13th century was rather like telling everyone that gravity was merely a suggestion. His theories shaped European medicine for well over 1,000 years. Central to their thinking was the theory of the 4 humours. Every human body, they believed, contained 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on these remaining perfectly balanced. Too much or too little of one humour could cause nearly any illness imaginable, from headaches to sadness to infertility. Conveniently, the theory could explain almost everything. Less conveniently, it could prove almost nothing. Doctors also believed the body possessed natural qualities of heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness. Men were generally considered naturally hotter and drier, while women were thought colder and wetter. Successful conception required these qualities to exist in proper harmony. If either partner was judged too cold, too moist, too dry, or lacking sufficient internal warmth, pregnancy might never occur. This obsession with bodily temperature produced some wonderfully creative conclusions. A woman who seemed excessively pale might be considered too cold to conceive. A man who appeared sluggish could supposedly lack enough natural heat to produce healthy seed. Neither diagnosis involved any measurable evidence, but both sounded convincing when delivered by someone wearing expensive robes and speaking in confident Latin. What makes medieval medicine fascinating is that these physicians were not irrational people. They carefully observed patients, compared symptoms, debated theories, and recorded treatments. They simply lacked the biological knowledge that later generations would take for granted. Without microscopes, genetics, or even a clear understanding of reproduction itself, they filled the enormous gaps with philosophy inherited from antiquity. For childless couples, these ideas shaped every consultation, every remedy, and every hope. Before herbs were prescribed or prayers were offered, the doctor first needed to determine which invisible imbalance had supposedly turned the body against its own most important duty, and from there, the explanations only became stranger. One of the more surprising aspects of medieval medicine is that doctors did not automatically blame women for infertility. Modern stereotypes often paint the Middle Ages as an era where every problem somehow became the wife's fault, preferably before breakfast. The reality was more complicated. Medieval physicians believed that either partner, or both together, could be responsible for a childless marriage. Their methods for deciding who was at fault, however, belonged firmly in the category of creative science. Ancient medical authorities had argued that both men and women contributed seed during conception. A healthy pregnancy depended on these two substances combining properly inside the womb. If either person's seed was weak, corrupted, too watery, too thick, or somehow lacking in vital heat, conception might fail. Since nobody had the slightest idea that sperm cells or eggs actually existed, these invisible qualities became the focus of endless speculation. Doctors often began by observing the couple themselves. Was the husband energetic or sluggish? Did he appear robust or frail? Was the wife healthy, pale, overweight, thin, cheerful, or melancholy? Every visible feature could supposedly reveal hidden imbalances inside the body. A tired-looking farmer might be diagnosed with weak reproductive powers simply because he looked exhausted, which, considering he had probably been working since dawn every day of his life, was hardly shocking. Age also mattered greatly. Physicians believed both men and women possessed a limited amount of reproductive vigour that gradually declined over time. Men who became too old were thought to lose their natural warmth, while older women supposedly became increasingly cold and dry. In medieval medicine, almost every road eventually led back to being either too hot, too cold, too wet, or too dry. Marriage itself sometimes came under suspicion. Doctors wondered whether the couple were simply incompatible. They believed certain combinations of bodily humours worked beautifully together, while others refused to cooperate. In other words, two perfectly healthy individuals might remain childless simply because their internal qualities did not agree. It was an oddly romantic explanation, if you ignored the complete absence of biological evidence. Some physicians even believed emotions influenced fertility. Chronic sadness, excessive fear, constant anger, or overwhelming stress could disturb the humours and interfere with conception. Ironically, this idea contains a tiny grain of truth. While medieval doctors misunderstood the mechanisms entirely, modern medicine does recognise that prolonged stress can affect reproductive health. Every so often, centuries of incorrect reasoning accidentally wandered near a correct observation. Not everyone accepted every theory, however. Medieval universities became lively centres of medical debate. Scholars argued over ancient texts, compared patient cases, and challenged one another's interpretations. The conclusions rarely resembled modern science, but the discussions themselves were often thoughtful and surprisingly sophisticated. Unfortunately for desperate couples, thoughtful debate did not necessarily produce effective treatments. Once the physician decided which partner or which mysterious imbalance was responsible, the real remedies could begin. And some of them would make even the most adventurous modern herbalist raise an eyebrow. Of all the organs medieval doctors tried to understand, none inspired more elaborate theories than the womb. Today we know it is a remarkable biological organ with a clear function. To many physicians during the Middle Ages, however, the womb seemed almost like an independent creature living inside the female body, temperamental, unpredictable, and occasionally determined to make life as complicated as possible. One of the most enduring beliefs inherited from ancient medicine was that the womb could become unhealthy if it remained unused for too long. Marriage and pregnancy were therefore considered not only socially desirable, but medically beneficial. A woman who remained unmarried into adulthood might, according to some physicians, suffer from retained fluids, dangerous vapours, or an accumulation of excess humours that interfered with fertility. In other words, the womb supposedly became bored. Modern gynecologists, thankfully, have retired this diagnosis. Doctors believed the uterus needed to be warm, moist, and properly positioned for conception to occur. If it became too cold, They imagined it could no longer receive or nurture the man's seed. If it became too dry, pregnancy would supposedly fail before it even began. These ideas all stemmed from the larger theory of humours, where every organ possessed its own delicate balance that required constant maintenance. The position of the womb also attracted enormous attention. Medieval physicians believed it could tilt, twist, sink, or even rise higher within the abdomen. Some inherited the ancient idea of the wandering womb, which suggested the uterus might move throughout the body, pressing against other organs, and causing symptoms ranging from shortness of breath to fainting spells. Fortunately for anatomy, the uterus is held firmly in place by muscles and ligaments, making spontaneous sightseeing tours around the body impossible. Because they thought the womb responded to smells, doctors sometimes recommended remarkably unusual treatments. Pleasant fragrances were applied near the lower body to encourage the womb downward into its proper position, while foul-smelling substances were held near the nose to drive it away from the upper body. The underlying logic was surprisingly consistent. If an unpleasant smell could make a person leave a room, perhaps it could persuade an organ to do the same. Physical appearance also entered the diagnosis. Women who were considered overly thin might be judged incapable of nourishing a child. Women who were heavier could be accused of having excessive moisture that smothered conception. There seemed to be a very narrow path between too little and too much, and physicians rarely agreed on exactly where it lay. Despite these misconceptions, medieval doctors genuinely tried to explain recurring patterns they observed. They noticed that age, illness, childbirth complications, and overall health influenced fertility. Lacking any understanding of hormones, ovulation, or reproductive anatomy, they interpreted these patterns through the only framework they possessed. Once they concluded that the womb itself was the obstacle, treatment shifted toward restoring its supposed balance. That meant warming it, cleansing it, strengthening it, and above all, persuading it to cooperate. As you might expect, this opened the door to an astonishing collection of herbs, oils, baths, and remedies that ranged from surprisingly sensible to wonderfully bizarre. Once a medieval doctor had decided why a couple could not conceive, the next step was treatment. This was where medicine became an intriguing blend of botanical knowledge, ancient philosophy, practical experience, and a healthy dose of optimism. Physicians rarely admitted they had no answer. If nature had caused the problem, then surely nature also provided the cure. Whether the cure actually worked was another matter entirely. Herbal medicine formed the backbone of almost every fertility treatment. Medieval doctors drew upon hundreds of plants described by Greek, Roman, and later Arabic scholars. Some herbs were believed to warm the womb, others cooled excessive heat, while still others supposedly purified the blood or restored balance to the humours. Every plant possessed its own personality. Rosemary strengthened the body. Sage promoted vitality. Fennel improved circulation. Mugwort became one of the most famous herbs associated with women's reproductive health. Interestingly, a handful of these herbs do contain compounds that affect the body, although rarely in the miraculous ways medieval physicians imagined. Some reduce inflammation, others aid digestion, and a few influence hormone activity very slightly. Their observations occasionally stumbled across genuine medicinal properties, even if the explanations behind them belonged more to philosophy than biology. Warm baths were another favourite prescription. Doctors believed gentle heat encouraged the womb to become more receptive to conception by restoring its natural warmth. Women might soak in water infused with herbs, flowers, or aromatic oils, while physicians confidently explained that hidden imbalances were slowly dissolving away. At the very least, A warm bath probably provided some welcome relaxation. After months or years of anxiety about infertility, that alone may have been one of the more beneficial treatments available. Diet also became part of the medical plan. Foods were classified according to the same qualities as the humours: hot, cold, moist, or dry. Lamb, eggs, almonds, figs, and certain wines were often recommended to strengthen reproductive power. Cold foods, excessive fasting, or an overly simple diet might be discouraged if doctors believed they weakened the body's natural heat. Meals, therefore, became medical therapy, with dinner occasionally carrying as much significance as the physician's consultation. Some remedies, however, wandered into far stranger territory. Poultices filled with herbs could be applied to the abdomen. Oils might be rubbed onto the lower back. Aromatic smoke from burning plants was sometimes directed beneath loose clothing in the hope that healing vapours would reach the womb itself. Exactly how smoke was expected to navigate the body's anatomy remained politely unexplained. Timing mattered as well. Physicians frequently instructed couples to follow carefully planned schedules based on seasons, lunar phases, or the woman's menstrual cycle, although their understanding of ovulation remained incomplete. They recognized that conception did not occur equally at all times, even if they misunderstood the biological reasons behind it. Despite the confidence with which these treatments were prescribed, success often depended less on medicine than on chance. Yet for medieval couples desperate for a child, these remedies offered something precious: hope. Even when science could provide few real answers, the belief that healing was still possible remained one of the strongest medicines of all. Not every medieval doctor believed infertility could be explained by the body alone. Medicine during the Middle Ages rarely existed in isolation. It shared space with astronomy, astrology, religion, philosophy, and local traditions, creating a world view where the heavens, the soul, and the human body were all thought to influence one another. If herbs failed and warm baths accomplished little, perhaps the problem lay somewhere far beyond earthly medicine. Astrology occupied a surprisingly respectable place in learned medicine. Many university-trained physicians consulted the stars before making important decisions. They believed the planets exerted subtle influences over every organ in the body, including those responsible for reproduction. The position of the moon was considered especially important because it governed moisture, growth, and the rhythms of nature. Since pregnancy itself followed a predictable cycle, many concluded that the moon must surely play a role. Doctors sometimes advised couples to attempt conception only under favourable planetary alignments. Certain zodiac signs were believed to encourage fertility, while others supposedly weakened it. A physician might spend considerable time calculating celestial positions before recommending the ideal moment for marital relations. Whether the stars actually cared about human family planning remains one of history's more unanswered questions. Religion offered another explanation that medicine alone could not provide. Many Christians believed children were ultimately gifts from God. If a couple remained childless despite every available treatment, some concluded that divine will was involved. This did not necessarily mean they were being punished. Infertility might instead be viewed as a mysterious test of faith, much like the biblical stories of Sarah, Hannah, or Elizabeth, who all experienced long periods without children before eventually giving birth. As a result, prayer often accompanied medical treatment rather than replacing it. Couples visited shrines dedicated to saints associated with fertility, lit candles, offered donations, or embarked on pilgrimages, hoping for divine assistance. Saint Anne, believed to be the mother of the Virgin Mary, became one of the most popular figures to whom childless women prayed. Faith and medicine worked side by side, each filling the gaps left by the other. Relics also played an important role. Churches across Europe claimed to possess holy objects capable of miraculous healing. A fragment of bone, a piece of cloth, or even a vial believed to contain sacred oil might attract couples desperate for children. Some reported miraculous pregnancies afterward. Modern historians, of course, cannot verify such claims, but they illustrate how hope remained as powerful as any prescription. Not everyone looked to heaven alone. In villages, folk traditions flourished alongside university medicine. Wise women, local healers, and experienced midwives recommended charms, protective amulets, or simple rituals passed down through generations. Learned physicians often dismissed these practices as superstition, yet ordinary people frequently trusted them just as much as expensive medical consultations. For medieval couples, infertility was never merely a medical condition. It touched every part of life, body, mind, family, community, and faith. When physicians ran out of explanations, the stars, the saints, and centuries of tradition were always waiting to offer another possibility. And as the search for answers continued, the line between medicine and superstition became increasingly difficult to see. If you were living in medieval Europe and struggling to have children, the most educated physician in the city might not actually be the person with the most practical experience. That distinction often belonged to the local midwife. While university-trained doctors spent years studying ancient books written in Latin, midwives spent decades observing real pregnancies, real births, and real women. Their classrooms were homes, not lecture halls, and their textbooks were experience itself. This created an interesting divide. Physicians possessed prestige and formal education, while midwives possessed something equally valuable: first-hand knowledge. They understood menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery, because they witnessed them constantly. A village midwife might assist with hundreds of births during her lifetime, gaining insights that no amount of reading could fully provide. When infertility became a concern, many couples quietly turned to these experienced women. Midwives often asked questions that physicians overlooked. They wanted to know whether menstrual cycles had changed, whether previous pregnancies had ended in miscarriage, whether childbirth injuries had occurred, or whether illness had recently affected either spouse. They could not explain these observations scientifically, but they recognized patterns through repeated experience. Unlike many physicians, midwives tended to focus less on elaborate theories about wandering wombs or planetary influences and more on the woman's daily life. They recommended nutritious food, adequate rest, gentle exercise, warm compresses, and herbal infusions they had seen help other women recover after illness or difficult births. Their advice was not always correct, but it was frequently grounded in practical observation rather than abstract philosophy. That did not mean every remedy was sensible. Folk traditions blended freely with genuine experience. Some midwives suggested carrying particular herbs inside small cloth pouches. Others recommended drinking special broths, prepared during certain phases of the moon. Protective charms, prayers, and blessings were common companions to herbal medicine. In medieval villages, medicine and tradition rarely travelled separately. Church authorities generally respected licensed midwives because childbirth was considered an essential service. However, tension occasionally developed between university physicians and these experienced women. Doctors sometimes dismissed female healers as uneducated or overly dependent on superstition. Midwives, meanwhile, occasionally viewed learned physicians as people who knew impressive Latin words but had surprisingly little experience delivering actual babies. Both sides probably had a point. Interestingly, modern historians believe midwives occasionally stumbled upon genuinely helpful practices. maintaining cleanliness during delivery, encouraging proper nutrition, and recognizing complications early all improved outcomes, even if practitioners did not fully understand why. Unfortunately, without knowledge of bacteria, hormones, or reproductive biology, they could only go so far. For couples facing infertility, however, the emotional support provided by an experienced midwife may have been just as important as any herbal remedy. She listened without judgment, offered reassurance, shared stories of women who conceived after years of waiting, and remained a trusted presence within the community. Sometimes hope itself became part of the treatment. By the late Middle Ages, these two worlds, book learning and practical experience, continued to overlap, disagree, and occasionally cooperate. Yet despite all their combined efforts, the greatest causes of infertility remained completely invisible to them. The true answers would have to wait several centuries for science to catch up. For all the confidence medieval doctors projected, there came a point where medicine simply ran out of explanations. A couple might faithfully follow every prescription, drink every herbal tonic, visit every respected physician within 50 miles, and still remain childless. When that happened, many people began looking beyond medicine altogether. The line separating science, religion, and magic was far blurrier than it appears today, and infertility often led people across it. It is important to remember that medieval people did not necessarily see magic as the opposite of medicine. Many believed the world itself was filled with hidden forces waiting to be understood. Certain stones supposedly possessed healing powers. Particular plants worked because of mysterious properties placed within them by God. Words, symbols, and rituals were thought capable of influencing nature in ways that could not always be explained. To modern eyes, this looks like superstition. To medieval minds, it often seemed perfectly reasonable. Protective amulets became especially popular among couples hoping for children. Small pouches containing herbs, written prayers, fragments of scripture, or blessed objects were worn around the neck or tied beneath clothing. Some believed these charms protected the womb from harmful spirits. Others thought they restored harmony to the body or attracted divine favour. Whether the power came from faith or from the object itself depended on who was asked. Written charms also circulated widely. A healer might carefully copy a short prayer in Latin, fold the parchment several times, and instruct the woman to carry it at all times. In some cases, biblical verses were combined with ancient symbols inherited from pre-Christian traditions. Medieval Europe was full of these curious mixtures, where religious devotion and older folk beliefs quietly shared the same piece of parchment without anyone appearing too bothered by the contradiction. Then there were the more unusual recommendations. Certain animal parts were believed to increase fertility if carried or consumed. The bones of particular birds, powdered antlers, hair organs, or eggs from specific hens occasionally appeared in medical collections. The reasoning behind these remedies often relied on symbolism rather than biology. Rabbits reproduced quickly, therefore something associated with rabbits might encourage human fertility. It was sympathetic magic at work, like influences like. Astrologers also entered the picture once more. Couples who had exhausted every treatment might pay someone to calculate an elaborate horoscope in search of hidden obstacles. A poorly positioned Saturn or an unfortunate conjunction between planets could conveniently explain years of disappointment. Unlike a physician admitting uncertainty, the stars always seem to have an answer. Perhaps the greatest irony is that many educated physicians officially criticized magical practices while quietly borrowing ideas from them whenever conventional medicine failed. A respected doctor might prescribe herbs during the day, recommend a saint's shrine in the evening, and privately suggest carrying an amulet just in case. Better to leave no possible remedy unexplored. If you had accepted an invitation to dine at the Tudor royal court, your first instinct might have been to admire the glittering tapestries, the silver plates, and the mountains of roasted meat arriving from the kitchens. Your second instinct, however, would have been considerably more practical. You might quietly wonder whether anyone at the table planned to survive dessert. To modern audiences, poisoning often feels like something confined to detective novels or Renaissance dramas. For the Tudors, it was a genuine fear. Whether the threat was as widespread as people imagined is another question entirely, but perception mattered almost as much as reality. A king who believed his enemies were everywhere rarely relaxed, especially when someone else had prepared his dinner. The Tudor dynasty began in uncertainty. Henry VII had won the throne only after years of civil war during the Wars of the Roses. His claim was not universally accepted, and plenty of defeated families still dreamed of replacing him. A suspicious ruler generally lives longer than a careless one, so Henry developed a cautious approach to almost every aspect of court life. Food was no exception. His son, Henry VIII, inherited that caution and expanded it into something approaching an art form. The king is often remembered for 6 wives, enormous feasts, and an increasingly impressive waistline, but he also ruled during an age of conspiracies. Religious conflict divided England. Powerful noble families competed for influence. Foreign ambassadors constantly gathered information. Court factions formed and collapsed with remarkable speed. Today's trusted advisor could become tomorrow's prisoner in the Tower of London. In such an environment, poison possessed a terrifying reputation. Unlike a sword or dagger, it required no dramatic confrontation. It could be hidden inside wine, mixed into sauces, or stirred into medicine. The victim might not realize anything was wrong until hours later, making it seem almost invisible. Whether poison was actually used as frequently as people feared is debated by historians, but the possibility alone shaped royal behaviour. The irony is that actual poisonings at the Tudor court were relatively uncommon compared to accusations of poisoning. Rumours spread through palaces almost as quickly as servants carried dinner plates. If a nobleman died unexpectedly from illness, whispers immediately began. Had he eaten spoiled food? Had God judged him? Or had someone quietly helped him meet his maker? Since doctors could rarely determine an exact cause of death, almost any sudden illness became fertile ground for speculation. Fever, stomach pain, vomiting, or collapse could result from countless diseases, but they could also fit popular ideas about poisoning. Without forensic science, certainty remained frustratingly out of reach. For Tudor monarchs, uncertainty itself became the enemy. Every meal represented not only a chance to display wealth and power, but also a small test of trust. Before a single bite reached the royal table, dozens of servants, officials, and carefully planned rituals stood between the king and his supper. They were not merely serving dinner, they were trying to ensure that England's ruler lived long enough to enjoy it. Once a Tudor monarch had reached the dining table, the most dangerous part of the meal was not choosing between roast venison or swan pie. It was trusting that neither had been prepared with murderous intentions. That is where one of the most famous figures in royal history entered the scene: the food taster. Popular films often portray the royal taster taking a dramatic bite before collapsing face first into the mashed turnips, heroically confirming everyone's worst fears. It makes for excellent television. History, however, was rather less theatrical. Food tasters certainly existed, but their duties were far more complicated than simply volunteering to eat suspicious stew. The people responsible for protecting the monarch's meals were among the king's most trusted servants. Many belonged to the royal household and had served the crown for years, sometimes decades. They were not random guards handed a spoon and wished good luck. Access to the king's food was tightly controlled, and only individuals with established reputations could participate in the elaborate dining rituals. One of the most important officials was the cupbearer. His responsibility was to present wine, ale, or other drinks to the monarch. Before handing over the cup, he often drank from it himself. This was known as assaying the drink. The same principle applied to food, where trusted officers sampled dishes before they reached the royal table. Contrary to popular belief, they did not necessarily sit down and enjoy a full meal before the king. Instead, they took carefully observed tastes or sips as part of a highly choreographed ceremony. In theory, if poison had been added shortly before serving, the taster would become ill first. In practice, this system had obvious limitations. Many poisons worked slowly, taking hours to produce symptoms. By the time the unfortunate taster felt unwell, the king might already have finished dinner, attended a council meeting, and complained about the weather. Fortunately, the Tudors understood that tasting alone was not enough. It formed just one layer in a much larger security system. The kitchens were heavily supervised, ingredients were carefully stored, and access to food became increasingly restricted as dishes moved closer to the monarch. The goal was to prevent poisoning altogether, rather than relying on one brave servant with an excellent appetite. Serving as a food taster was therefore both prestigious and dangerous. Success meant earning the king's trust, dining in close proximity to one of the most powerful people in Europe, and enjoying considerable status within the royal household. Failure, on the other hand, could prove memorable for all the wrong reasons. Ironically, most food tasters probably spent their careers eating perfectly ordinary meals without incident. Their greatest achievement was that nothing happened at all. In the Tudor court, surviving another banquet without anyone collapsing into the gravy counted as a remarkably successful day's work. Long before a roast peacock or steaming venison pie reached the king's table, it passed through one of the busiest workplaces in Tudor England. The royal kitchens were not simply large, they were enormous. At Hampton Court Palace alone, hundreds of servants worked every day to prepare meals for the king, his family, visiting ambassadors, noble guests, guards, musicians, and the ever-growing population of the royal household. Feeding the Tudor court was less like cooking dinner and more like managing a small city that happened to smell strongly of roasting meat. At first glance, such a crowded kitchen might seem like the perfect place for a poisoner to operate unnoticed. After all, dozens of cooks stirred pots, butchers carved meat, bakers prepared bread, and servants hurried between roaring fireplaces carrying heavy trays. Yet this very complexity forced the Tudors to create an organised system that made secret tampering surprisingly difficult. Every member of the kitchen had a clearly defined role. Some prepared only meat, while others baked bread, brewed ale, roasted game, or made delicate pastries for special occasions. Important ingredients were received, counted, and stored carefully. Senior officials supervised supplies, ensuring that valuable food did not mysteriously disappear or mysteriously acquire suspicious additions. The royal pantry, buttery, cellar, and larder all functioned as separate departments, each responsible for specific foods or drinks. The buttery, despite its name, dealt mainly with ale and wine rather than butter. The pantry oversaw bread, while the cellar controlled valuable wines imported from France and Spain. Dividing responsibilities reduced confusion and made it easier to identify where something had gone wrong if problems arose. As meals were prepared, the number of people allowed to handle each dish gradually decreased. A roast might begin its journey surrounded by dozens of kitchen workers, but by the time it approached the king's table, only a handful of trusted servants remained involved. Every transfer from one official to another became part of an established routine designed to maintain security. Cleanliness also mattered, although not quite for the reasons we might expect today. Medieval and Tudor people certainly understood that spoiled food could cause illness, even if they knew nothing about bacteria. Rotten meat, contaminated water, or mouldy bread were recognized as dangerous. Keeping food fresh protected the king from ordinary sickness, just as much as it protected him from imagined assassins. Fire presented another constant danger. The vast roasting hearths burned almost continuously, surrounded by wooden buildings packed with fuel, cloth, and barrels of supplies. A careless spark threatened the entire palace. Kitchen discipline therefore protected not only the monarch's dinner, but also the monarch himself. Ironically, despite all the elaborate precautions against poison, the greatest danger lurking in many Tudor kitchens was probably simple food poisoning rather than deliberate poisoning. Undercooked meat, poor preservation, or contaminated water posed far more frequent threats than secret assassins. But those dangers lacked the drama of palace conspiracies, and history has always had a soft spot for a good conspiracy. By the time a meal finally reached the Tudor king, it had become much more than lunch or dinner. It was a carefully choreographed performance. Every movement, every servant, every plate, and every cup followed established rules that had been refined over generations. To a visiting ambassador, the ceremony demonstrated the immense power of the English crown. To the king himself, it provided something equally valuable: reassurance that nobody had quietly seasoned the soup with poison. The Tudors loved ceremony. Almost everything at court followed elaborate rituals, from waking the monarch in the morning to helping him retire at night. Dining was no different. A royal banquet was not simply about eating. It was a public display of order, hierarchy, and discipline. Every official knew precisely where to stand, when to move, and what responsibilities belonged to them. One of the most important figures during the meal was the gentleman carver. Armed with an exceptionally sharp knife and years of training, he carved roasted meats directly before the king. This was not merely entertainment. Carving the meat in front of the monarch allowed trusted eyes to examine the food one final time before it was eaten. If something appeared unusual, it could be noticed immediately. The cupbearer performed an equally important role. Before presenting wine to the monarch, he followed the traditional ceremony of assaying the drink. The cup itself was carefully handled, inspected, and sampled according to established custom. Noble guests often admired the graceful precision of the ritual, while the king probably appreciated the comforting fact that someone else had taken the first sip. Even the dishes themselves travelled according to strict procedures. Food did not simply appear from the kitchen carried by whichever servant happened to be available. Instead, trusted officers escorted valuable dishes through a series of controlled stages until they reached the royal dining chamber. Each transfer was observed, reducing opportunities for anyone to secretly tamper with the meal. The king rarely dined alone. Members of the royal household, important nobles, foreign ambassadors, bishops, military commanders, and honoured guests might all be present. Hundreds of eyes watched every movement. Ironically, this constant audience became another layer of protection. Secretly poisoning the king in front of dozens of experienced courtiers required extraordinary confidence or extraordinary foolishness. Many dishes arrived covered with ornate lids that remained sealed until the final moment. This helped preserve heat, but it also reassured everyone that the contents had not been disturbed during the journey from the kitchens. Fresh bread, silver goblets, polished trenchers, and gleaming serving vessels all contributed to an atmosphere where every detail suggested careful control. Of course, these rituals served another purpose beyond safety. They reminded everyone present that the monarch occupied the very centre of the kingdom. No ordinary noble received such elaborate attention. Every carefully choreographed movement reinforced the king's authority as much as it protected his health. For modern observers, the entire performance can seem almost excessive. Yet in an age where rumours travelled faster than facts and sudden deaths invited endless suspicion, ceremony became its own form of security. If every servant followed every rule in full view of the court, then trust became easier to maintain. Whether the system could truly stop a determined poisoner remained uncertain, but it ensured that anyone considering such a crime would face far more than a single plate of food. They would have to outwit an entire royal machine. Despite all the elaborate ceremonies, trusted servants, and carefully guarded kitchens, one question continued to haunt the Tudor court. What if someone actually succeeded? What if poison found its way onto the king's plate or into his wine? It was a terrifying possibility, made even worse by the fact that very few people truly understood how poisons worked. The substance most feared throughout Tudor England was arsenic. It earned the rather dramatic nickname inheritance powder because of its reputation for quietly removing inconvenient relatives from the line of succession. Unlike brightly coloured potions imagined in modern films, arsenic was often tasteless and nearly colourless when mixed into food. More importantly, its symptoms, stomach pain, vomiting, diarrhea, and weakness looked remarkably similar to common illnesses, such as food poisoning or dysentery. This made arsenic especially frightening. A victim could become violently ill, die days later, and nobody could say with certainty whether disease or murder was responsible. Without chemical testing or modern forensic science, proving poisoning was almost impossible. Suspicion often mattered more than evidence. Mercury also appeared in Tudor medicine, though not always as a poison. Physicians actually prescribed mercury to treat certain diseases, particularly syphilis. The treatment itself was so toxic that patients frequently suffered terrible side effects, including excessive salivation, tooth loss, and neurological damage. Doctors considered this unfortunate, but acceptable. After all, if the medicine nearly killed you, surely it must be doing something useful. Medical logic has thankfully become a little more selective since then. Plant poisons inspired equal concern. Deadly nightshade, hemlock, monkshood, and foxglove all grew in parts of Europe and were known to heal in tiny quantities while killing in larger ones. Herbalists understood that dosage mattered enormously. A skilled healer could prepare a useful remedy from the same plant that an assassin might exploit for murder. Nature, it seemed, possessed an unsettling talent for multitasking. Imported poisons from the continent acquired almost mythical reputations. Italian courts, especially those associated with powerful Renaissance families, became infamous in English imagination for secret toxins and invisible assassins. Whether these stories were entirely deserved remains debatable. The Tudors often viewed continental Europe through a mixture of admiration and suspicion, and tales of exotic poisons fit comfortably into that world view. Ironically, many sudden deaths blamed on poison were probably caused by entirely natural diseases. Typhoid, cholera, severe food poisoning, appendicitis, ulcers, and countless infections could produce symptoms nearly identical to those associated with toxic substances. When a healthy nobleman collapsed after a banquet, the simplest explanation was not always the most exciting one. Human beings have always preferred conspiracies to unfortunate digestive problems. This uncertainty shaped Tudor politics in profound ways. A rival who died unexpectedly could spark weeks of gossip. An ambassador who became ill during negotiations might suspect foul play. Even the monarch's own physicians struggled to distinguish murder from misfortune. In the end, poison became powerful, not only because it could kill, but because it could never be completely ruled out. In a court where ambition flourished and trust was a precious commodity, uncertainty itself became one of the deadliest weapons of all. For all the elaborate precautions surrounding the Tudor court, actual cases of proven poisoning were surprisingly rare. Accusations, however, were everywhere. In Tudor England, being suspected of poisoning someone could be almost as dangerous as committing the crime itself. Once rumours began circulating, they spread through the royal court faster than servants carrying fresh bread from the kitchens. The greatest fear was not simply that someone wanted to kill the king. It was that the assassin might already be standing nearby, smiling politely while offering another glass of wine. One event did more than any other to shape Tudor attitudes toward poisoning. In the year 1512, during the reign of Henry VIII, a bishop's household in London served a meal that left dozens of people violently ill. 2 guests died shortly afterward. The cook, Richard Rouse, confessed under questioning that poison had somehow entered the food, although historians still debate exactly what happened and whether the confession itself was reliable. Henry VIII reacted with extraordinary severity. Rather than treating poisoning as an ordinary murder, Parliament passed a remarkable law declaring it to be an act of high treason. The punishment reflected the king's horror. Richard Rouse was sentenced to death by being boiled alive in a massive cauldron of water at Smithfield. Even by the brutal standards of the 16th century, this execution shocked many people. Hanging was common. Beheading was reserved for nobles. Boiling alive seemed almost unimaginably cruel. The punishment was designed not only to execute one man, but to terrify anyone else who might consider using poison as a weapon. Whether Rouse had truly intended murder remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest he may have accidentally added poisonous substances while preparing food. Others believed he deliberately targeted the bishop. Since investigations relied heavily on confessions and rumour rather than forensic evidence, the complete truth has probably disappeared forever. The law itself revealed how seriously Henry viewed invisible threats. A sword attack required courage and offered the victim a chance to defend himself. Poison, by contrast, appeared cowardly. It attacked without warning, ignored armour, bypassed palace guards, and could strike even the most powerful ruler while he sat peacefully at dinner. The Tudor court soon became filled with stories of secret plots. Foreign ambassadors were occasionally viewed with suspicion. Rival nobles watched one another carefully. Physicians who prescribed unfamiliar medicines sometimes found themselves under uncomfortable scrutiny. If someone important died unexpectedly, whispers almost always followed. Ironically, many of these rumours had little evidence behind them. A fever could become poison by the time gossip reached the opposite end of the palace. An ordinary stomach illness might transform into an assassination attempt after passing through half a dozen storytellers. Every retelling added another suspicious detail until the tale barely resembled the original event. This atmosphere of constant suspicion shaped everyday life at court. Trust became one of the rarest commodities in Tudor England. A servant delivering a meal, a physician offering medicine, or a noble presenting an expensive gift, all had to overcome one invisible obstacle, proving that their kindness concealed no deadly intentions. In the Tudor world, the fear of poison often proved more powerful than poison itself. Sometimes the greatest weapon was not a hidden toxin, but the simple possibility that one might exist. Even after the last plate had been cleared away and the wine cups emptied, the Tudor monarch was not entirely safe. If poison hidden in a banquet failed to reach him, there remained another route straight into the royal body: medicine itself. To modern ears, this sounds alarming. Surely the king trusted his own physicians. He did, but trust in Tudor England was never unconditional. Doctors were respected, richly rewarded, and often highly educated, yet they also possessed something few others had: direct access to the monarch at his weakest moments. They prepared remedies, mixed potions, recommended strange ingredients, and occasionally handed the king substances that looked suspiciously like poison. The uncomfortable truth was that some medicines actually contained poisonous materials. Mercury, for example, remained one of the most common ingredients in Renaissance medicine. Physicians prescribed it for a variety of illnesses, believing it could purge harmful substances from the body. Patients rubbed mercury ointments onto their skin, inhaled mercury vapours, or swallowed preparations containing the metal. Many became desperately ill from the treatment itself. Excessive drooling, swollen gums, loose teeth, tremors, and exhaustion were considered unfortunate signs that the medicine was working. The cure often proved nearly as dangerous as the disease. Other remedies contained antimony, lead compounds, or powerful herbs that had only a narrow margin between helping and harming. A skilled physician might prepare a useful dose. An inexperienced apothecary or a dishonest one could easily produce something far more dangerous. This is why apothecaries occupied such an important position in Tudor society. They gathered herbs, imported exotic spices, ground minerals into powders, and prepared medicines according to a physician's instructions. Their workshops resembled curious combinations of kitchens, laboratories, and spice shops. Shelves overflowed with dried plants, glass jars, oils, roots, resins, and ingredients whose names alone sounded mysterious enough to inspire confidence or concern. Because medicines were prepared by hand, quality varied enormously. Two remedies made from the same recipe might differ considerably depending on the purity of the ingredients or the skill of the person mixing them. Mistakes happened. Measurements were imprecise. Labels could be confusing. Occasionally, patients suffered simply because the wrong herb had found its way into the mixture. Naturally, every unexpected death invited fresh rumours. If a nobleman died after taking medicine, some whispered that the physician had been bribed. Others suspected the apothecary had substituted ingredients. Still others imagined foreign agents had somehow infiltrated the royal household. More often than not, the truth was far less dramatic. Medicine during the 16th century remained an uncertain science, and many treatments simply failed. The king's doctors understood this better than anyone. They examined urine, felt pulses, studied the colour of the patient's skin, and consulted ancient medical texts in search of answers. They genuinely wanted to heal their royal patient. Unfortunately, they were trying to treat illnesses they barely understood with remedies that were sometimes hazardous themselves. For the Tudor monarch, then, danger came not only from enemies hiding poison inside a feast, but occasionally from loyal physicians trying their very best to keep him alive. In a court filled with suspicion, even the bottle marked medicine could inspire a cautious glance before the first swallow. After everything we've explored, food tasters, guarded kitchens, elaborate ceremonies, suspicious medicines, and horrifying punishments, you might wonder whether the Tudors were genuinely surrounded by poisoners or simply surrounded by fear. The answer, as is so often the case in history, lies somewhere comfortably in the middle. Poison certainly existed, and political murder was hardly unknown in Renaissance Europe. Kings, princes, bishops, and wealthy nobles possessed fortunes, land, and influence worth killing for. Remove one important person, and an entire kingdom's balance of power might change overnight. The motive was real. The opportunity occasionally existed. Yet historians generally agree that poisoning was far less common than people at the time believed. Part of the problem was that death itself remained mysterious. A modern doctor can perform blood tests, toxicology reports, and laboratory analysis. If you had walked through the elegant streets of St. Petersburg in the early 20th century and asked who held the greatest influence over Russia, you might have expected to hear the Tsar, the Prime Minister, or perhaps one of the empire's powerful generals. Instead, someone might have quietly whispered another name, Grigory Rasputin, a peasant from a tiny Siberian village who wore simple robes, spoke with a rough country accent, and somehow found himself welcomed into the drawing rooms of Russia's wealthiest families. On paper, it made very little sense. Rasputin had no university education. He held no government office. He was not a bishop, a famous scholar, or a decorated military officer. His beard was untidy, his clothes often looked worn, and nearly everyone who met him commented on his intense, unsettling eyes. Some described them as compassionate. Others found them deeply unnerving. Almost everyone agreed they were unforgettable. Born in 1869 in the Siberian village of Pokrovskoye, Rasputin spent his early life as an ordinary peasant. He worked the land, married, had children, and seemed destined for the same quiet existence as generations before him. Then, sometime in his late 20s, he experienced what he described as a profound religious awakening. He abandoned much of his former life and began travelling across Russia as a wandering holy pilgrim, visiting monasteries, sacred sites, and remote churches in search of spiritual understanding. These wandering pilgrims, known in Russia as straniki, were not unusual. They travelled from village to village, living simply while preaching repentance and prayer. Rasputin, however, possessed something many others lacked. He had remarkable charisma. He spoke without the polished language of educated clergy. His words were direct, emotional, and deeply personal. Rather than delivering complicated theological arguments, he talked about sin, forgiveness, suffering, and God's mercy in language ordinary people immediately understood. Some listeners found him inspiring. Others considered him dangerous. Very few remained indifferent. When Rasputin eventually reached St. Petersburg around 1903, Russia's capital was experiencing a spiritual crisis of its own. The city's aristocracy possessed immense wealth, but often felt dissatisfied with the formal rituals of the Orthodox Church. Across Europe, educated elites had developed a fascination with mysticism, faith healers, seances, and unusual religious teachers. Many noble women attended spiritual salons where conversations drifted effortlessly between philosophy, prayer, and the supernatural. Into this fashionable world walked a barefoot Siberian peasant who seemed completely authentic. Unlike polished church officials, Rasputin appeared untouched by ambition or sophistication. He spoke passionately, prayed intensely, and gave the impression that his faith came from genuine experience rather than careful study. For many aristocratic women, exhausted by court etiquette and endless formalities, this authenticity proved irresistible. They did not initially seek him because of scandal or romance. They came seeking spiritual guidance, comfort, healing, or simply the chance to meet a man whose reputation had begun spreading through the capital, almost like a whispered legend. None of them could have imagined that this unlikely pilgrim would soon become one of the most controversial figures in Russian history. Nor could they know that the growing number of women visiting his apartments would eventually fuel rumours so extraordinary that they would outlive the Russian Empire itself. When people hear Rasputin's name today, they often imagine scandal, political intrigue, or the dramatic stories surrounding his death. But that is not why most women visited him in the beginning. They came because they believed he could heal them, or someone they loved. At the start of the 20th century, medicine remained frustratingly limited. Doctors could perform impressive surgeries for the era, but many illnesses still had no reliable treatment. Antibiotics had not yet been discovered. Mental health was poorly understood. Chronic pain, Nervous disorders, epilepsy and bleeding diseases often left physicians with little more than educated guesses. When conventional medicine reached its limits, people naturally looked elsewhere. Russia had a long tradition of holy men, wandering pilgrims, monks and mystics who were believed to possess special gifts. Some were respected by the Orthodox Church, while others existed on its fringes. Ordinary peasants frequently sought blessings from these spiritual figures, asking them to pray over sick children, comfort grieving families, or offer guidance during difficult times. What made Rasputin unusual was that he attracted not only poor villagers, but also members of the highest aristocracy. Many wealthy women in St. Petersburg lived lives of extraordinary privilege, yet they often carried burdens invisible to the outside world. They experienced miscarriages, lost children to disease, struggled with depression, or lived in unhappy marriages arranged for political or financial reasons. Society expected them to appear graceful and composed regardless of their private suffering. Rasputin offered something many felt they could not find elsewhere: someone who listened. Visitors frequently described his ability to make conversations feel intensely personal. Rather than delivering long sermons, he asked questions, encouraged confession, prayed with people, and spoke as though he genuinely understood their fears. Whether this reflected supernatural insight or remarkable emotional intelligence remains a matter of debate. Whatever the explanation, many people left feeling calmer than when they had arrived. Prayer formed the centre of nearly every meeting. Rasputin believed sincere faith could accomplish what medicine sometimes could not. He encouraged visitors to trust God, abandon despair, and seek spiritual peace rather than obsessing over their suffering. Even modern psychology recognizes that a calm, reassuring presence can reduce anxiety and help people cope with illness. That does not mean miraculous healing occurred, but it may help explain why so many believed they felt better afterward. His greatest reputation as a healer emerged through the imperial family itself. The heir to the Russian throne, Tsarevich Alexei, suffered from haemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevented normal blood clotting. Even a relatively minor injury could become life-threatening. Doctors could do almost nothing to help him, and every new bleeding episode plunged the royal family into panic. On several occasions, after Rasputin prayed for the young prince, or even sent reassuring telegrams from hundreds of miles away, Alexei's condition appeared to improve. Historians continue to debate exactly why. Some suggest Rasputin's calming influence reduced the anxiety surrounding the child, while others believe he encouraged doctors to stop treatments, such as aspirin, that unknowingly worsened bleeding. Whatever the explanation, the imperial family became convinced that he possessed extraordinary gifts. From that moment onward, Rasputin's reputation spread through Russian high society with astonishing speed. If the mysterious Siberian pilgrim could comfort the heir to the throne, perhaps he could also heal anyone else. Before long, the line of women hoping to see him grew longer than ever, and with every new visitor came another story, some sincere, some exaggerated, and some that would soon become impossible to separate from myth. As Rasputin's reputation spread through St. Petersburg, something remarkable began to happen. The visitors arriving at his door were no longer only peasants seeking blessings or worried parents hoping for a miracle. Increasingly, elegant carriages stopped outside his modest residence, carrying some of the wealthiest and most influential women in the Russian Empire. To outsiders, it seemed almost absurd. Why would countesses, princesses, and society ladies, women who could afford the finest doctors, the grandest churches, and every luxury imaginable, choose to spend hours listening to a bearded Siberian peasant with rough hands and little formal education? The answer begins with understanding the strange loneliness of Russia's upper class. Life among the aristocracy appeared glamorous from the outside. Grand palaces glittered beneath chandeliers. Lavish balls filled enormous halls with music and dancing. Servants attended to nearly every need. Yet beneath all that elegance, many noblewomen lived surprisingly restricted lives. Marriages were often arranged for status rather than affection. Every public appearance demanded perfect manners. Every conversation was governed by strict etiquette. Every mistake risked becoming tomorrow's gossip throughout the capital. Very few people spoke honestly. Rasputin did. He addressed duchesses exactly as he addressed peasants. He showed little concern for titles or noble rank. Some aristocrats found this behaviour insulting. Others found it strangely refreshing. For women accustomed to constant flattery and careful politeness, meeting someone who ignored social conventions entirely could feel almost liberating. Many gatherings took place in private apartments rather than churches. Visitors sat together while Rasputin prayed, discussed scripture, or spoke about repentance, humility, and the struggle against temptation. The atmosphere was often informal. Rather than delivering polished sermons from a pulpit, he encouraged conversation. Guests asked personal questions about grief, marriage, faith, illness, and family problems. Several women later described these meetings as deeply emotional experiences. Rasputin possessed an unusual ability to make people feel they had his complete attention. Whether speaking to a princess or a servant, he maintained intense eye contact and listened carefully before responding. Modern psychologists might describe this as exceptional interpersonal skill. His followers saw something far more mysterious. Word spread quickly through St. Petersburg's exclusive social circles. One noblewoman told another that the Siberian holy man had comforted her after the death of a child. Another claimed he had helped restore her faith during a difficult marriage. Others insisted his prayers brought them remarkable peace. Each story attracted new visitors, and each new visitor carried another story back into aristocratic society. Of course, not everyone came seeking spiritual guidance. Curiosity proved just as powerful as faith. Rasputin had become one of the city's most talked-about figures. Some women simply wanted to see whether the rumours were true. Was he genuinely holy? Did he really possess hypnotic eyes? Could he truly predict events or heal the sick? Visiting Rasputin became almost a social phenomenon among certain circles of the capital. This growing popularity also had an unintended consequence. The more frequently wealthy women were seen entering and leaving Rasputin's home, the more gossip began to circulate. Political enemies, newspaper writers, and jealous members of the aristocracy watched these visits with increasing fascination. Before long, innocent meetings devoted to prayer and conversation were being transformed into stories of secret affairs, hidden rituals, and dangerous influence. Rasputin's reputation was no longer being shaped by the people who knew him, it was being rewritten by those who had never set foot inside his room. As more women visited Rasputin, St. Petersburg's rumour mill began working overtime. It did not matter that many meetings consisted of little more than prayer, conversation, and spiritual advice. To people outside his circle, appearances told a far more exciting story. Elegant noblewomen arrived at the apartment of a rugged peasant late into the evening, stayed for hours, and left speaking of his extraordinary gifts. For a city that thrived on gossip, the temptation to invent the rest was almost irresistible. Rasputin certainly did little to discourage speculation. Unlike many religious figures, he enjoyed attention. He dressed simply but carried himself with remarkable confidence. He spoke freely with women, laughed easily, and seemed completely comfortable ignoring the rigid social boundaries that governed aristocratic society. In a culture where noble ladies were expected to maintain impeccable dignity, Seeing them casually converse with an uneducated Siberian mystic shocked many observers. Soon, whispers began. Some claimed Rasputin believed sin itself could bring people closer to God. According to these stories, one had to experience temptation before true repentance became possible. Critics argued that he used this idea to justify inappropriate relationships with female followers. The problem is that historians remain deeply divided over how much of this was actually true. There is little doubt that Rasputin was an unconventional man. He hugged visitors, held their hands during prayer, and sometimes embraced people while offering blessings. Such behaviour was unusual among Orthodox holy men, particularly when directed toward aristocratic women. To devoted followers, these gestures represented compassion and spiritual closeness. To his enemies, they appeared scandalous. The newspapers eagerly chose the more sensational interpretation. Although government censorship limited what journalists could publish directly about the imperial family, rumours spread through private letters, satirical pamphlets, and whispered conversations at fashionable salons. Every woman seen visiting Rasputin became another opportunity for speculation. If a countess called upon him twice in 1 week, surely something improper must be happening. If she visited 3 times, the imagined details became even more elaborate. Political opponents recognized an opportunity. Rasputin's growing influence over the imperial family made him a convenient target. If they could destroy his reputation, they might also weaken the Tsar and Tsarina. Stories of secret affairs therefore became useful political weapons. Some accusations came from genuine witnesses, others from second-hand gossip, and many simply grew larger each time they were repeated. By the time a rumour had passed through several drawing rooms, it often bore little resemblance to the original event. Even the secret police struggled to separate truth from fiction. The Okhrana occasionally placed Rasputin under surveillance, recording his movements and collecting reports from informants. Their files suggest that Rasputin did engage in behaviour that many considered morally questionable. He drank heavily at times, enjoyed female company, and could behave in ways that clashed sharply with the image of a humble, holy man. Yet the evidence also indicates that many of the wildest stories circulating across Russia were greatly exaggerated or completely fabricated. That distinction mattered very little to the public. Legends rarely depend on careful evidence. They grow because they are entertaining, shocking, and endlessly repeated. Before long, Rasputin was no longer simply a wandering pilgrim who prayed with troubled women. He had become a symbol onto which an anxious empire projected every fear, fascination, and fantasy it could imagine. And nowhere would those fears matter more than inside the imperial palace itself. Among all the women who visited Rasputin, none would shape his reputation more than Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. Their relationship became one of the most controversial in Russian history, inspiring countless rumours that still circulate today. Yet if we strip away the sensational headlines and examine why the Tsarina trusted him, the story becomes far less scandalous and far more tragic. Alexandra was living with a fear that almost no one outside the imperial family fully understood. Her only son, Tsarevich Alexei, suffered from haemophilia, an inherited disease that prevented his blood from clotting properly. A simple bruise could become life-threatening. A fall while playing could leave internal bleeding that doctors were powerless to stop. Every ordinary childhood accident became a potential disaster. The imperial physicians did everything they could, but early 20th century medicine offered few answers. They prescribed rest, various medications, and endless observation, yet Alexei continued to suffer terrifying episodes. The Tsarina watched her son endure agonizing pain, while the finest doctors in Russia admitted there was little they could do. Then came Rasputin. Whenever the young heir experienced one of his attacks, Alexandra often turned to the Siberian holy man. Sometimes he travelled to the palace and prayed beside Alexei's bed. On other occasions, he simply sent a telegram urging the family to remain calm and trust in God. Remarkably, several of these episodes appeared to improve shortly afterward. Modern historians have proposed several explanations. Rasputin's calm presence may have reduced the anxiety surrounding the boy, allowing him to rest more peacefully. Some researchers believe he persuaded doctors to stop giving Alexei aspirin, which unknowingly thinned the blood and worsened bleeding. Others suggest coincidence played a significant role. Whatever the true explanation, one fact is beyond dispute. Alexandra became convinced that Rasputin could save her son's life. From that moment forward, her trust in him became almost absolute. To the Tsarina, Rasputin was not a political advisor or a mysterious magician. He was the man who repeatedly brought comfort when every expert had failed. Any mother who believed someone could ease her child's suffering would likely cling to that hope with extraordinary determination. Unfortunately, the rest of Russia saw something entirely different. Members of the aristocracy noticed the peasant visiting the imperial palace with surprising frequency. Government ministers heard stories that the empress sought his advice before making important decisions. Foreign diplomats reported strange rumours back to their own governments. Newspapers, restricted by censorship, hinted darkly that an unknown force had gained influence over the throne. Before long, imagination filled every gap. Some claimed Rasputin secretly controlled the Tsarina. Others insisted he manipulated government appointments, directed military policy, or whispered commands directly into the empress's ear. The most outrageous rumours accused them of carrying on a romantic affair, despite historians finding no credible evidence to support such claims. The story spread because it explained what many people could not otherwise understand. Why would an empress place so much trust in an uneducated Siberian peasant? In reality, Alexandra's devotion grew from desperation rather than romance. But in an empire already shaken by political unrest, military failures, and growing public anger, truth mattered less than perception. Every visit Rasputin made to the palace strengthened the belief that mysterious forces were influencing the Romanov dynasty. By the time the First World War engulfed Russia, the holy man had become far more than a spiritual advisor. To millions of Russians, he had become the living symbol of everything they believed was going wrong with the empire. As criticism of Rasputin grew louder across Russia, something equally remarkable happened. The attacks did not drive his followers away. In many cases, they strengthened their loyalty. Every newspaper accusation, every mocking cartoon, and every whispered scandal convinced his supporters that the holy man was being persecuted precisely because he spoke uncomfortable truths. This was not unusual in religious history. Many charismatic spiritual leaders have attracted two completely opposite reactions at the same time. To some, they appear wise and compassionate. To others, they seem manipulative and dangerous. Rasputin inspired exactly this kind of divided opinion. Very few people regarded him as merely ordinary. Among his closest followers were women who believed he had transformed their lives. Some said he had restored their faith after years of spiritual emptiness. Others believed his prayers had helped them recover from illness or survive periods of overwhelming grief. Several noblewomen later wrote that Rasputin possessed an extraordinary gift for making people feel seen. In an aristocratic society obsessed with appearances, they described him as someone who looked beyond titles and social rank. Whether these experiences reflected genuine spiritual comfort or the remarkable power of suggestion remains impossible to determine. What matters historically is that the women themselves believed they had encountered something extraordinary. Many returned again and again. Rasputin's gatherings became regular events. Visitors arrived seeking advice about marriages, family disputes, illness, religious doubts, or simply the loneliness that often accompanied life among the Russian elite. They prayed together, discussed scripture, confessed personal struggles, and listened while Rasputin offered encouragement in his own plain, emotional style. Unlike many educated priests, he rarely quoted complicated theology. Instead, he spoke in stories. He compared faith to planting seeds, forgiveness to cleaning a dirty window, and pride to carrying unnecessary weight on one's back. His language was simple enough for peasants, yet meaningful enough to captivate members of the imperial court. That unusual combination helped explain why audiences from completely different social classes felt equally drawn to him. Critics, however, saw something very different. They argued that Rasputin deliberately surrounded himself with wealthy female admirers because they provided gifts, influence, and protection. Expensive clothing, generous donations, comfortable apartments, and invitations into noble homes certainly suggested that his growing fame brought considerable advantages. Even some church officials questioned whether a man who claimed to embrace humility should enjoy such comforts. His supporters answered these accusations with remarkable consistency. They insisted the gifts were freely offered out of gratitude rather than requested. They argued that people misunderstood Rasputin because they judged him by appearances instead of listening to his message. Every attack from newspapers, politicians, or church leaders only reinforced their conviction that an innocent holy man was being slandered by jealous enemies. The division became so intense that Russia seemed unable to agree on who Rasputin actually was. Was he a gifted spiritual advisor comforting desperate people? A clever manipulator exploiting vulnerable followers? A sincere believer whose flaws became wildly exaggerated? Or something that contained pieces of all three? By the outbreak of the First World War, those competing images had become impossible to separate. Rasputin no longer belonged solely to the people who met him. He belonged to public imagination. And in times of national crisis, legends often become far more influential than facts. By the winter of 1916, Rasputin had become one of the most hated men in Russia. To his followers, he remained a humble servant of God who had been unfairly slandered by jealous aristocrats and ambitious politicians. To his enemies, he was a corrupt mystic whose influence over the imperial family threatened the future of the empire itself. Few public figures had ever inspired such fierce disagreement. A growing number of nobles reached a startling conclusion. If Russia was to be saved, Rasputin had to disappear. Leading the conspiracy was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in the empire. Joining him were Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of Tsar Nicholas II, and several other aristocrats who believed they were acting out of patriotism. Their plan was simple, at least on paper. Invite Rasputin to Yusupov's palace, murder him quietly, and remove the man they blamed for the monarchy's declining reputation.